Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another ship review episode. And today we are going to be looking at this modified Leander class, the Perth of the Royal Australian Navy. Now in World of Warships, this is going to be a tier 6 under the Commonwealth Navy. So my guess is probably in the future we're going to see some other Commonwealth ships, maybe something from the New Zealand Navy, maybe the Canadian Navy. I'm hopefully, really looking forward to something from the Canadian Navy. But, well, this time we're going to be talking about the Perth, and I'm just going to sort of do what I usually do in ship reviews, go over her stats and port, talk about her skills of her captain, and of course modules, and then take her into battle. Now, before I get into this review, I do have to say one thing, which is, if the Perth is an indication of what Wargaming is doing with premiums, I actually like it. I really like the direction they're going with these premiums. Now, in the past, what we typically got was premiums that were always better than their tech tree counterparts. And in the last little bit, notably with Belfast and now Perth, I'm starting to see a little shift, I guess, in the way that they're thinking about premium ships. They're no longer just trying to make something that's going to be better than the tech tree counterpart. Instead, they're sort of opting for what appears to be something different, at the same time being the same base ship. So you'll see what I mean in a little bit. These ships are going to be somewhat similar to the tech tree ships, but they're going to have things that make them play pretty differently. So let's take a look at a Perth, and let's sort of look over what makes her unique. In terms of her survivability, the Perth is, well, she's basically a Leander. The same sort of vulnerable armor, well, actually the lack of armor that the Leander has. I mean, 13mm on the bow, 13mm on the stern. So that means that's overmatched by 203mm guns. So that means you'll be taking penetrating hits from heavy cruisers. And then if you take a look at her Citadel area, her Citadel is much lower to the water compared to other British cruisers. Let's say a tier lower, with the Citadel sticking up a lot more. This one is a little bit further down, but it's right at the waterline, coming out a little bit. So shots through the waterline generally are going to net Citadel hits. In terms of the armor protection at the Citadel, well, you've got side plating that's 100mm thick, so that's not all that great, although it can be effective if you angle relatively well. So, armor protection, not all that great. In terms of HP, at 27,100, she has slightly less HP than the fully upgraded Leander, but, I mean, they are pretty similar in terms of survivability. The guns is where the Perth really differs from the Leander on the British tech tree. Now, it's got the same guns, these 152mm guns. Reload time is 7.5 seconds. 180-degree turret traverse times of 25.7 seconds. This is all pretty similar. Speaking of the turret traverse, it does traverse a little bit slow for 152mm guns. Sometimes you really do kind of hope that the guns traverse a little bit faster. At least that was my experience. And I'll get to the reasons why for that in a second. Max dispersion, 121 meters, isn't really that great when you consider the range of the guns, which they only go out to 12.8 kilometers. Actually, it's one of the reasons why the turret traverse speed is really not that great, because with that kind of max range, a lot of times you're going to be fighting quite a bit closer, and you do want your turrets to traverse a bit faster. But unlike the British cruisers, the Perth actually has high explosive ammo. So the HE shells on this ship do max damage 2100, and there's a 9% chance of setting fires, which means that you really need Demo Expert. Now, I had to play the ship without Demo Expert, and it was painful. Although I do think if you had Demo Expert, it should help. She also obviously has the AP shells. They do 3100 max AP damage. And in terms of all of the stats, they all, at least on paper right now, they all look the same. However, the Perth's AP doesn't have the abilities in terms of penetrating destroyers that the British line does. The detonator times are a lot longer, so if you shoot at destroyers, you are going to get overpens. So, this plays, when it comes to its guns and everything, plays a lot more like a regular cruiser, so you have to keep that in mind. Secondary armament isn't all that great. You have a couple of 102mm secondary guns that shoot some HE shells, with decent range, but again, nothing spectacular there. Torpedo-wise, the Perth has torpedoes that are identical to the fully upgraded set on the Leander. You have 8 km torp range, they go 61 knots, they do 15,433 damage. You know, reload time and everything, they're all identical. They even have, of course, the same abilities to fire a narrow spread or fire individual torpedoes. So, torpedo armament-wise, the Perth is the same. AA defense, the Perth is actually the weakest compared to the Leanders. Even when in the stock configuration, the stock Leander's AA is still better. So the Perth's AA isn't all that great, and you also don't have defensive fire, so you're not going to get anything else to really sort of make up for that AA defense. Not very good AA, so she is going to be somewhat vulnerable to air attack, which is actually going to bring up something pretty interesting when you look at the consumables that she has. The Perth, very much like the Leander, is a pretty maneuverable ship. Your max speed isn't great, but still reasonable for a cruiser, 32.5 knots. Really decent turning circle radius, 640 meters, and of course, very much like other British cruisers, the Perth accelerates when she turns, so that's really nice. Very fast rudder shift time, 7.6 seconds. Her concealment is a bit better than the Leander at 10.01. Oh, sorry, 10.1 on the surface, not 0.1, my bad, and 6.9 from the air. So, in terms of most of her stats, she is very similar, the exception really being the guns. But the Perth has some other things going for her, and, well, you know, you could say it's something good, and at the same time not so good, but it happens to do a lot with the consumables. So, the Perth, unlike the Leander, has no heal. Instead, what she has is she's got the same sort of damage control, she's got the same hydroacoustic, but she does have a heal, and instead you get the choice to either choose a catapult fighter or a spotting aircraft. Aha. The aircraft selection is very interesting, I think. So remember I mentioned the really bad AA? Well, if you have really bad AA, you really could use a catapult fighter. So if somebody attacks you, especially another carrier, you have at least some additional defense there. So catapult fighter could be useful. But remember the other weakness, 12.8 km range, not very good range, and you really do want to have a spotting aircraft, so you can sort of shoot at things a little bit further away. Now, I've personally played her with the spotter plane, just because I feel like having that range is more useful than having that extra little bit of defense against the aircraft, especially when CVs are maybe not as common. I would say spotting aircraft, just get the spotting aircraft. It's a little bit more, it offers you a little bit more utility. You don't always have to get really close to stuff. You can sort of be a little bit further away. And the reason why that is important has also a lot to do with her smoke. Now, the Perth does have a smoke, much like the way the Leander has a smoke, but her smoke is very different. So, the Leander smoke, now, the Leander smoke, let me just sort of go over it, is a 7-second activation smoke, but the smoke puffs themselves last for like 90 some odd seconds. So the Leander smoke, once you activate it and you're able to stay within it, you can't really move too much. But the smoke does immediately go into cooldown. So by the time your smoke runs out after like 90 some odd seconds, the remaining time between that smoke puff going away and you getting a new smoke to use is relatively short. Now the Perth has a completely different kind of smoke. She's got a smoke that is, once you hit the activation, really long activation. It just keeps going for like 90 seconds. It'll continue to generate smoke. But the smoke screen is only active for 10 seconds. So once the puff of smoke comes out, it's only active for 10 whole seconds before it disappears. So you can't really be laying too much cover for your team. What you're mostly doing is one of two things. Either using it for yourself as cover, or generating a very slow moving smoke cloud that you or your team can use. But the problem, of course, is that you have this whole 90-second activation. All of the time when that's going on, the smoke consumable is not going to cool down. So once you run out of smoke, when the smoke activation stops, you've got 160 seconds that you gotta wait, which is basically like 2 minutes and 40 seconds, I think, where you're going to be sitting there with no smoke. But if you load up, of course, I mean, if you load up things like flags and jack of all trades, which I don't recommend, like you can get that smoke a bit
faster to cool down, but it's nothing great there. And you're really going to be waiting a while for the smoke. So it's different. The two ships' smokes are vastly different, and they affect the way you can play the ships. With the Leander, if another ship was trying to get behind an island, you can't crawl out of your smoke to keep engaging them. With the Perth, you can just crawl forward at like anything under 12 knots, and you can kind of come around islands and keep shooting at them. So it does offer some differences. Also with the Perth, if let's say you're under attack and you're in your smoke, you can still turn and keep laying smoke and maybe keep yourself safe and allow yourself to turn away. Something that won't be possible with a Leander, where you get a puff and a half and that's it. And if you try to move more or try to speed up more, you're just going to come out of your smoke and get obliterated. So it does change the playstyle of the Perth when compared to the Leander. In terms of modules, the Perth is pretty straightforward. I would say get main armaments mod 1, then get aiming systems mod 1, then get Damacon mod 1, and then get steering gears mod 2. Now, I would say get steering gears because, you know, having a more agile rudder, having that additional agility is really going to help in those sort of more tight areas where the Perth is ideally going to be fighting. And also just because propulsion mod 2 and damage control system mod 2 really don't offer that big of an advantage, especially propulsion mod 2, because the Perth is pretty fast when it comes to accelerating. So that's something. And speaking of acceleration, there is one other thing. The Perth's engine does have 500 more horsepower than the Leander. So during my play, I did find that the Perth accelerated a bit faster than the Leander, although that could have been purely subjective, but I did feel like she accelerated really, really well. In terms of her captain's skills, and I had to make do without Demo Expert, because this ship we weren't given any real sort of high point skill captains to test with, so I guess, you know, from playing her and really thinking I needed some things, I would say go with basic firing training on 1, get expert marksman on 2, get superintendent on 3, get demo expert on 4. You really, really, really need demo expert. The 9% fire chance is painful at times. You're just shooting and just shooting and shooting, not getting those fires. You really, really need demo expert. And then, of course, on the 4th row, get concealment expert. The ship really can do with some extra stealth. She just doesn't deal with damage all too well. So being stealthy, being not easy to target might be a huge boost to your survivability. Once you get past the 15 skills, with your remaining skill points, you can opt for things like potentially incoming fire alert. You can opt for things like torpedo armament expertise. You can maybe offer things like advanced firing training. You know, if you want to do like a 3-point and a 1-point, you could opt for either expert loader or basics of survivability, and then opt for perhaps you could opt for something like, I wouldn't say high alerts being all that useful. I would even say maybe like torp acceleration if you're really, you know, having to engage in a lot of close range torpedo fighting. Maybe the extra speed would help, and maybe vigilance because you're going to be tangling with destroyers. Maybe any extra time in terms of warning for torpedoes could be very, very useful. And that pretty much does it from the port view. Let's take a look at the Perth in action, and I'll sort of point out anything and everything else I noticed about her when I've been playing her.
So where do I start with the Perth? And I think the best place to start is to answer the fundamental question, is this a good ship at all? And I think my answer to that question is no. I played the Perth a bunch of times, and she was always the kind of ship where it just felt like some of the things about her just didn't connect very well. I mean, if you have something like, you know, I would just say the Belfast. I mean, you had that combination of many 152mm guns, lots of HE spamming ability, you had radar, you had all these things to play with. You had a smoke that lasted quite a while, you could sit in smoke, you could do all these things. The Perth, it was more of that disconnect. Like, yes, when I had a smoke, I could push out and be a little bit aggressive. The minute my smoke ran out, I knew I was in for like 2+ minutes of not having a smoke. So therefore, I needed to have an island. But if something happened when I was near the island, I just didn't have anything else really to, you know, sort of going for me. She was more of a frustrating ship, I think is the best way to put it for me. And I think that if you were, and honestly, I think that this ship has a pretty high skill cap. I think if you were somebody who is maybe a little bit on the average side, this ship might not really be your thing. So I guess the way to put it is, if you wanted to buy a ship that was maybe historical or maybe just for the sake of lulz, for fun, then sure, the Perth can be fun. But I wouldn't really play her on a regular basis, as she just felt like a more frustrating ship to me than something that was fun. So initially, at the beginning of this battle, I came down into this area with lots of islands, thinking that it would be okay for me to come here and support my team, ideally the destroyers that are pushing up. I do have pretty good stealth, and I do have HE, so I can use them on destroyers. Now you might notice that I did have AP loaded, and at the time I was really just testing the AP to see what it did against destroyers, to see what was going on. And again, here's another thing. With the Perth, I found the ship less capable of really carrying a battle. This is not a kind of ship that I would be able to, let's say, rack up high enough damage or do enough things where I would say, yes, I was able to carry that battle. This ship was a lot more of a support vessel. You mostly used it to support things. The nice thing about the smoke, and this is one thing I do have to say, is that it does give you the ability to really, let's say, disengage and continue to lay yourself a smoke. So in this case, my destroyer came into this island area and very quickly left. So very, very soon I was by myself, which means not a good place to be. So with other ships, you might really struggle with getting yourself out of there because your smoke would have been laid, and if you step out of the smoke, you get spotted. With Perth, the smoke keeps going. So you can back yourself out, you can turn around, and you can exit, and nobody would ever really see you. So this also does provide, in certain circumstances, the ability to come into an area, slow down, pop the smoke, get on the area, see what you can do, and then if things aren't favorable, you can exit the area. That is something that the Perth is capable of doing, something that other smoke ships really aren't that capable of doing if their activation time is much, much shorter. The Perth does have good torpedoes. I do have to say that. She does have torpedoes. They are usable. They have good range. They do good damage. And having them being able to single fire is really, really useful. Not in this battle. This battle I actually didn't get a single torpedo hit, but in other battles I've been able to go up and just basically fire all of them in a nice tight bunch and really do quite a lot of damage, more so than I would have had I used the narrow spread, which might have led to, let's say, a miss or two. Alright, so I've exited out of the area, no real danger to me because not spotted by anything inside the area when I was coming out. Not by the battleships, not by the cruisers, so it's good. By the time I get out, I'm in a much, much safer position. I see over here my battleships versus two of their battleships, and of course being tier 8 battleships, no, I'm not going to go in there. Even though I am supposed to be a quote-unquote support ship, going in there with 2 North Carolinas would have been pretty suicidal, as enemy North Carolinas would have deleted me with no real difficulty whatsoever. So instead, I disengaged from fighting battleships because that would not have been a good fight. And I try to go back into an area where I can fight things that are a little bit easier to fight, cruisers and destroyers. And you will see at one point in time that the Belfast is at least reasonably good. Reasonably good at dealing with destroyers. Still, compared to something like the Belfast, she's not as good. And one of the big reasons for that is that when you go bow in to minimize your profile to torpedoes, you only have a grand total of 4 guns. Compared to if you were in a Belfast, you're talking about 6 guns. Or if you were in a Bodioni or Cleveland, there's significantly more guns. So having 4 makes it a little bit challenging to deal with destroyers. Against Atlanta, I actually should have used AP here, but had HE loaded because I was dealing with the destroyer, and the Atlanta was just a low enough HP where HE would have just done just fine there. Both our battleships actually ended up ramming, I think, the other battleships. So that battle was a completely even thing. There was no other threat in this area. So of course I continued to chase the destroyer. The Benson, of course, is trying to get out of there as quickly as humanly possible in reverse too, and I'm doing my best to try to chase him down. Of course, I have the hydroacoustic search activated, so I will be able to continue to keep track of him. But remember the thing about the Perth's armor. Not great armor, and truth be told, if that Benson knew what he was doing, and I was coming out broadside and I kept going broadside, he could have AP'd me to death. Now, of course,
I didn't want to give him that chance, so I angled away from him, presenting a much more angled profile, and just preventing him from being able to Citadel me to death. Now, of course, as you can tell, my AP not very effective because, again, it is regular armor piercing, not the special British type armor piercing where you have that really, really short detonator times and that you can get those nice penetrating hits. With the Perth, you have to resort to HE, which can be nice. I mean, you get lots of penetration from HE, that kind of damage. You do get a lot of that. But I do think the British cruisers with their AP, they just do quite a bit more because 33% of 3100 is quite a lot of damage.
So the Benson popped smoke and escaped. And with my Hydro running out, well, I'm beginning to play a little game of cat and mouse. I'm going to chase the Benson through the smoke, hope I get a proxy spot, and see if I can finish him off. Now, one of the things, again, when you're doing this, you really have to be careful. I mean, the Perth just doesn't have that much forward firepower. Only has 4 guns, and it's just not always great for this particular role. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, other things that I guess was sort of mentioned before, but didn't really show in this particular battle is that the scout plane, in a lot of circumstances, for the Perth is very, very useful. It will allow you to start shooting at stuff from a better range. And if you can do it at, I guess, close to max range, you might even be able to maintain a certain degree of stealth and not get spotted. Alright, pop around the corner, Farragut on one side, Benson on the other. So, of course, focus to Benson. Don't ask where that shot went. Don't ask where the next one went either. Had a little bit of just, I don't even know what that was. But I do manage to finish off the Benson there. Managed to dodge all the torpedoes fired by the Benson and the Farragut, turn my attention to the Farragut, and this is the thing, right? It's like HE's still pretty darn effective against destroyers. Not perfect, but still pretty darn effective. And that Farragut, well, in for a bad time, as my first salvo did like 3,400 to him, and with the next salvo, I essentially will finish him off. Now, of course, he burned his torpedoes relatively early, so allowed me to have an easier time at it. So with all the enemy destroyers on this side of the map gone, the other one is really, really far away on the one line, as well as a couple of their battleships. I see their cap as being pretty much open with nobody defending it, so I'm just going to turn the ship around and go straight for the enemy cap. As you can tell, the Perth does turn pretty quickly, and of course during her turns she maintains speed very, very well. It's like a British Commonwealth sort of trait, I guess. They're just going to be able to maintain that speed quite well. And yeah, so the turn is completed relatively quickly. The rudder shift isn't too bad, actually. So she is pretty agile, which is good if you're in sort of like tight areas that you've got to make lots of turns, or you got to maneuver in tight areas, or deal with destroyers and try to dodge their torpedoes and things like that. I mean, the agility is good enough for that. Still, I mean, the biggest problem I had with this class of ship was that she felt somewhat limited in terms of what she could really fight effectively. Not having the greatest range, not having any real sort of armor to defend you from larger caliber shells just made the ship feel very, very fragile and also very limited in what she could really be effective against. Her smoke, while nice, it's a very sort of selfish smoke. You really can use it for yourself. I mean, yeah, maybe if you work really great with a teammate in a division, you guys can have a rolling smoke cloud going. I guess that could be something. But again, I mean, when you really, really think about it, even then, it's like even if you had a division mate who was going to roll smoke with you, you'd have to have 3 of them. Like, sorry, well, you plus 2 of them, so 3 of you in total, cycling perfectly to make sure that you guys can constantly stay in smoke. Because you think about the cooldown of the smoke, it's quite long. And if they deploy for 90 seconds, you go on cooldown, your division mate deploys for 90 seconds, they go on cooldown, and you're still not off of cooldown, a 3rd division mate has to pop for another one before you can get another smoke going. So I guess you could have a permanent rolling smoke cloud that can shoot at stuff and fire HE at stuff. But individually,
If you were a solo player and you're trying to get teammates to cooperate and work with you, it's a rare occurrence. And that kind of scenario, I don't know, the Perth really does struggle. There were other battles, by the way, that I had in the ship where, and this is one of the better battles. If you know, like at the end in terms of total damage numbers, this is actually one of the better battles. I mean, other battles, like okay, you ended up with like 40 something thousand damage, and like that was it. There's some battles you just got nuked by a battleship that looked at you the wrong way. I mean, you know, a couple shots hit him, boom, there it goes, and you don't have a heal to recover any HP. Very fragile. And I mentioned that smoke issue as well. It's like if you're by yourself and you run out of smoke, it's like all of a sudden you're missing something. It's like your ability to conduct certain operations just come to a standstill, and then you pretty much have to depend on islands for over 2 minutes in order to at least keep yourself relatively safe from return fire. Because remember, she doesn't really have a lot of armor, so return fire just kind of sucks. You get hit by any sort of larger caliber shell, and it really does hurt. Speaking of the smoke, right? So I said you have to stay under 12 knots in order to in order to really not outrun your smoke. So that means running your ship at somewhere between a quarter speed and half speed. Now, if you go to half speed, your ship actually goes faster than 12 knots, which means you'll outrun your smoke. So you generally keep it to a quarter, because if you're engaging something, you're constantly adjusting speed up and down, it becomes a little bit too much sometimes. So just set it to quarter speed and inch out slowly. And this is the thing I was talking about, the inching out slowly part. If I was with another British cruiser, like let's say I was playing a Leander, I would pop smoke and get cover, but as the turrets turned to try to get cover behind this island, I wouldn't have been able to do anything in terms of chasing them out. I would have had to stay behind my island and hope the turrets came my way. Well, with the Perth, you can continue to lay smoke, and as you can tell, the smoke clouds just sort of keep going, and you can keep pushing out a little bit and sort of maintain that angle of engagement against an enemy target. So that is actually very, very, very handy. But again, once the smoke runs out, like I mentioned earlier, you don't have smoke for quite a while, which really is an issue with the ship. So as the turrets goes down, we are going to be able to basically win the match, and I'm going to end up with something like just short of 80,000 damage. So, you know, and that for a tier 8 battle is actually not too bad. But let's address the final sort of question. Should you get the Perth? Well, if you're a collector, and also you want to, of course, get yourself ready for future Commonwealth ships, or, you know, you just want something fun and different, then, yeah, the Perth will definitely sort of suit you. However, if you're looking for something that you can carry and something that is a great ship that's competitive, sadly, I just think the Perth isn't that. I mean, while she has very interesting mechanics, and I like how she is so different from the Leander, and I think it's a great direction to see premiums be of the same hull, of the same general design, but completely different in terms of playstyle, or just has unique perks to make them different, is quite a bit better than the system of the past, where the premiums are just always better. So I do like the direction they're going. However, when it comes to the Perth, I'm just not really won over by the ship. Like, while she has her perks and her uniqueness, she just wasn't all that good. There was just too many holes for me. Like, her guns, the range wasn't good enough. The concealment was good, but not great enough that you can really use it to stay safe. Her smoke, while very unique, I mean, there's this huge gap after your smoke is done before you get another smoke. And it's just, there's too many holes for me, and I can't in good conscience recommend this ship for the majority of people out there. Anyways, folks, I hope this ship review has been helpful for you in deciding whether or not you want her. If you have any questions, please leave those in the comment section below. Don't forget to leave a like, and aside from all that, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.